Welcome to the shop. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video, I'm going to be putting together young Link's Kokiri sword from Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Now, not long ago, I put together the Deku shield, and if you want to check that build out, I'll have a link up above. Now, both the sword and the shield are scaled for young Link, so keep that in mind if you're building it for yourself and you need to have it scaled up, scale that PDF. Because these are really designed more for display pieces. I want them in my game room. Now, this sword is of course made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and I want to thank everybody that's been supporting me by purchasing my HD foam through Blick, especially those that have been going through the links that are in the description section and those that are on my website, because I do receive a small vendor affiliate, which allows me to continue to build awesome things like this and show you how to do it. So let's go ahead and jump into the build, because I want to show you what it takes to put together this sword and paint it. Let's go ahead and get started. In my previous video, I'd made the Deku shield, and I wanted to make sure that the Kokiri sword was scaled properly, so my PDF for this was printed over several sheets and then cut out with a scalpel blade. You of course can also download this file. There's a link over in the description section. Now, to give this sword some stability and that bevel in the middle of the blade, I'm going to be using a fiberglass yard marker. These can be picked up at just about any hardware store pretty cheap. I cut away the template for the blade and then transfer that onto some 6mm HD foam with a pencil. 6mm will work great because I don't want the blade to be too thick. Both blade pieces can then be cut out using a utility knife. To adhere the two sides of the blade together, I'm going to be using some weldwood contact cement. This is generously applied to both halves, and then a bead of super glue is run directly down the middle. This is really important because it's going to keep my fiberglass rod in place and in the middle of the blade. So the other half of the blade is pressed down onto the fiberglass rod first, and then the edges will be pinched together. This will give a defined slope from the middle to the perimeter of the blade. So I slowly work my way across, and once all the edges are secured, I can then go back and press together firmly the middle. Now this gives the blade a good start, but I need to taper it even further, so I mark out the detail section at the bottom of the blade, as well as the line that runs through the middle. This will give me a good visual when I'm sanding the foam down. Once complete, I take the blade over to my belt sander and start to knock down the foam along the edge. I don't do much on this tool because I feel like I have better control with my hands, so I switch over to a medium grit sanding drum on my Dremel rotary tool. At this time, I'm just trying to refine the slope from the crest of the blade out to the edge. After that has been refined, I switch over to a smooth sanding drum. This will help me get rid of all of the marks that the medium drum has left, and it helps me round over the foam. For my last steps, I hand sand with a sanding sponge and some high grit sandpaper. This makes the surface really smooth. The guard of the blade is going to be made up of two pieces of 10mm foam that will be glued together. Once again, I'm going to be using contact cement for this process. Now notice before I add superglue that I've cut a small channel into the foam. This is for the fiberglass rod. Superglue is added and the foam is firmly pressed together before I take it over to my bandsaw to be cut out. And like I've said in past videos, if you don't have a bandsaw, it's no problem. You can still cut it out by hand and refine everything with your rotary tool. After this piece has been cut out, I slide it up the fiberglass rod just to make sure that it fits well. And once I've determined it's a-okay, I can glue it into place. Now the edges on the guard have a slight bevel to them, and I knock that down by hand using my Dremel rotary tool and a medium grit sanding drum. Just like the blade, once the majority of the foam has been removed, I can then switch over to a smooth sanding drum to refine the edges. Now this process could have been done beforehand, but I felt that stability-wise it just would have been easier with it attached to the blade. A sanding sponge is used to buff the surface, and then I use my heat gun to lightly heat the foam. This will close all the pores and make the surface nice and smooth. Just like the guard, the handle will also be cut out of two pieces of sandwiched together 10mm HD foam. The template is transferred onto the foam, and these are cut out with a utility knife, and I make sure to mark the middle of each handle. This is important because I remove the material just like the guard so that the fiberglass rod can sit flush inside. Contact cement is once again used along with a little bit of super glue. I do my double adhesive method because this is going to be a heavy wear area. I also insert a 1/4 inch dowel at this point. This is just to help support the foam while I refine the shape. It will be taken out later on and the fiberglass rod will go in its place. Using my Dremel rotary tool one more time, I go ahead and round over the edges of the handle until it has a nice fit. The sanding sponge is used once again to smooth all the foam out, and now the wooden dowel can be removed. The handle is then slid up the fiberglass rod, and I check my template to see how much further up it needs to go. The top of the handle can now be refined, and I start by removing some of the material from the middle. The top is rounded over just slightly, and I remove a little more material until it sits flush against the guard. There's a flat part at the base of the blade that I knew I wasn't going to be able to achieve from just the 6mm foam itself, so I'm adding 2 triangles of 1mm foam to either side. Now I know Blick doesn't carry my 1mm online, but I still have some left in my warehouse, so if interested, hit me up. To make the pommel at the end of the handle, it's going to be comprised of 3 pieces of 10mm HD foam all stacked together. Once the basic shape is cut out by hand, I can start to refine it using my Dremel rotary tool. To create the detail piece in the center of the guard, I start by tracing my template onto some 6mm HD foam. These 2 pieces are first rough cut with a scalpel blade and then cleaned up using the rotary tool. To make the jewel in the center of this piece, I start by cutting some 20mm HD foam round dowels. These sections can then be refined with the rotary tool until they're round on top. Using my template, I mark exactly where the detailed piece is going to go in the middle of the guard, as well as the detail rivets along the sides. Now I can glue down the detail piece to the middle of the guard, as well as the stone. To simulate the rivets that go on either side of the guard, I'm going to be using some black furniture nails. Now I'd already marked exactly where they need to go with my template, so it's just as easy as pressing them into the foam. I'll glue them in a little later. To create the ridges along the handle, I start by marking where they need to go. And then I score the surface of the handle with an extended utility blade. This slight cut into the foam opens up a considerable amount when heat is applied to it with my heat gun. Now remember, when you're heating up foam, to always wear your respirator and do it in a well-ventilated area. After I see the fit is just right, I add a little bit of super glue and glue it into place. Now I can glue those tacks into place with a little bit of Bob Smith super glue. After looking at it, the pommel needed to be rounded out a little bit more, so I did that and then reheat the surface with my heat gun. This made the surface nice and smooth, and I could drill a small pilot hole directly in the middle. This hole is going to be for a wooden dowel that's first glued into the handle. Now honestly, I would have liked for the fiberglass rod to run through this entire piece, but it just wasn't long enough. So this is my go around, and it works fine. I just glue the pommel onto the end of the handle. Now the tip of the blade is fairly soft and can get messed up pretty easy, so I've shown in another video exactly how to make this stronger. I'm going to be painting it with super glue. I squirt a little bit of super glue all over the tip of the blade and then use a scrap piece of foam to paint it onto the surface. I do this process one more time before I sand the surface with a sanding sponge, and that'll help the tip of this blade retain its point. To fill some of the seams and ease the transition on the blade, I'm going to be using some Quick Seal as a gap filler. This material is applied with a silicone tip tool into the cap, and then I wet my finger and rub it over the surface. This will smooth it out and get rid of any tool marks. This process can then be repeated on the other side of the blade as well as the pommel. After the Quick Seal had been allowed to dry, I then went back in with a smooth sanding drum to knock down the foam to make the transition more seamless. Now it's time to seal and paint the sword, and like the Deku shield, I'm going to be using Creature Cast, which is a neoprene rubber. I'm also going to be using some Neothix to thicken the material up. I'm going to use a chip brush to apply the Creature Cast directly to the sword. Now if you want a smoother finish, you could also use a critter gun or an airbrush. Now this particular blade has a grain striation to it that I saw in almost all of the different concept arts, especially the high definition ones. So that's a big reason why I'm using a chip brush to get those lines in the metal. Now you can tell here that the Creature Cast is a little thick, so the lines are pretty prominent, so to knock those down I'm going to be using a piece of upholstery foam. This foam allows me to smooth out the Creature Cast but still keep the striations that the chip brush applied. After the blade had somewhat dried, I went ahead and applied Creature Cast to the guard, and I once again used the foam to smooth out the surface. And just like I had mentioned in the Deku Shield build, Creature Cast is very similar to an acrylic paint, so I can use a hairdryer to speed up the dry time. To smooth the surface of the blade, I want to wet sand it, so I'm adding a second layer of Creature Cast. That way when I start sanding, I'm not going through the rubber down to the foam. Creature Cast is also brushed onto the handle and the pommel in the same process of applying it with the chip brush and then smoothing it with the upholstery foam. Now to wet sand the blade, I take my sandpaper and I dip it into a little bit of water, and then I lightly buff the surface just to smooth it out. Krylon Flat Black Primer is used over the entire surface of the sword. Once dry, I go back in with some more sandpaper, and I'm really happy with how smooth the surface is and how much it's matching the concept art. Rust-Oleum Antique Pewter is lightly applied to all the metallic parts. This will give it a good base for all the acrylics that will be hand painted. Liquitex Heavy Body Iridescent Bright Bronze is applied to the guard with a 1/2-inch filbert brush. Remember when you're using Liquitex metallics that they're fairly opaque and not to add any water to them. This same color is also applied to the pommel. The grip of the handle will be painted with a mixture of Liquitex Heavy Body Burnt Umber and Unbleached Titanium. This paint is also applied with a filbert brush as a single coat over the entire surface. Once that layer had dried, just a wash of burnt umber is applied to the entire surface, and then a wet paper towel is used to mop up a lot of the paint. Once dry, one more layer of the unbleached titanium mixture can be dry brushed over the surface. This will give it an aged, battle-worn look. For the detail section around the jewel, I'm going to be using Golden Brand Iridescent Bronze. This paint is also fairly opaque, so I'm making sure not to get it onto the guard. To paint the jewel in the middle of this, it's going to require several different steps. So to start off, I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body Cadmium-Free Red Medium mixed with some Iridescent Bronze. This darkened mixture is applied with a small filbert brush over the entire surface. Then I start to highlight the jewel by applying some of the cadmium red directly to the top and a little bit on the bottom. To make this shadow for the bottom of the jewel, I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body Brilliant Blue. This is mixed in with the cadmium red and applied, and then I go back in with some more of the cadmium red over the top. These layers will give the jewel some depth and make it a lot more visually interesting. Using some Liquitex Heavy Body Parchment, I'm going to add a highlight to the jewel. This is applied with a very small detail brush following the contours of the foam. As a last step, I apply some Vallejo brand gloss varnish just to give it a sheen. Now to work on the blade, I'm going to start by applying some Liquitex Heavy Body Iridescent Rich Silver. This paint is applied directly over the spray paint that I had added earlier, and it gives the surface a very reflective sheen. Now I want this blade to have a two-tone color scheme just like the cartoon concept art. So I start by using some blue tape to mask off half of the blade. For the two-tone, I'm going to be using Createx Transparent Bright Blue in my Iwata airbrush. Because this paint is a transparent, it goes directly over the iridescent silver that I've already applied, but it doesn't kill the metallic sheen down below. I use a hairdryer just to make sure that the airbrush paint is set, and then I can remove my masking tape. The masking tape is then reapplied to the lower section of the blade and more transparent paint is used. I'm really happy with how the texture and the color scheme came out on this blade. It almost exactly matches the high definition concept art, and it's going to look great in my game room. So you all can see what it takes to put together young Link's Kokiri sword from Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now hopefully you all are enjoying these videos. If you are, give them a thumbs up, share them with your friends and family, and remember, if you're building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.